First, I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for being here today, but mostly thank you for the work that you're doing every day. Our gratitude for what you're doing is endless, so thank you. The theme of this first Virtual Sun focuses on lessons learned from the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis. During the first half of today's program, we will hear about how valuable, how critical simulation training is and has been to help prepare, train, and support healthcare workers through the COVID-19 pandemic. Those that have been through the peak have much to share with those that are still in the beginning stages. We have seen that simulation training is necessary for healthcare workers to prevent contamination of PPE. As hospitals have experienced staff shortages, we have seen how simulation training is essential for getting new and less experienced healthcare professionals up to speed quickly and efficiently. Not only on skills like ventilation management and intubation, but also team training and communication. We have seen how simulation has also been useful for practicing new protocols and practicalities like how to work in a reconfigured workspace. As you're all aware, the coronavirus outbreak has disrupted our everyday lives. Around the world, we have had to find different ways of working. We've had to be creative. As conferences and meetings move online, there are some challenges, but there's also some opportunities for reaching wider audiences quicker, reducing the carbon footprint of travel, and improving diversity. While we know it's different and we'll miss the human connection, we hope that we'll be able to provide an intimate and inspiring experience today nonetheless. With this in mind, we are very excited to welcome you to the first annual Global Virtual Sun event. We dedicate this conference to you, the healthcare heroes and simulation specialists who leads the way forward. On behalf of everyone here at Lærdal, we wish you a great event.
Hello and welcome to this first ever Global Virtual Sun meeting organized by Lærdal Medical. My name is Bjorn Egeland, and together with my colleague Andrew Christopik in the United States, we will guide you through this very special day. I hope you're all set, that the power cord is plugged into your computer, and if you're watching this on your mobile phone, that the battery is fully charged, because it all starts now. We have an interesting and very relevant list of speakers on the agenda today. We will start with Professor Peter Dieckmann, who is regarded as one of Europe's leading experts on medical simulation, and he will be joining us in a few minutes from Copenhagen. The following hour, we will continue with Sigrun Anne Kvinnesland and Kjetil Torgersen, both affiliated with the Safer Simulation Center here in Stavanger. They will also be joined by Dr. Kurtz from the stroke unit at Stavanger University Hospital. The next hour, again, will take us to the United Kingdom, where Dr. Nick Murch and Clinton John will enlighten us in their experience from setting up and running the purposely built simulation center attached to the Nightingale Hospital at the Excel Center in London, operated by the National Health Service as a COVID-19 hospital. The last hour will take us to the Stony Brook University Hospital in New York, where we will learn more about how they coped with the tsunami of COVID-19 cases there. We will be talking to Dr. Mark C. Henry and several of his colleagues during the last hour of this Virtual Sun meeting. Now, before we start, I just want to tell you that we will be muting all the sound from everyone that joined this conference to reduce background noise. Please use the Zoom Q&A function if you want to raise any questions during the event. This Virtual Sun meeting will be recorded. So you will get an email after this event is over later today, and with a link to where you can find the recordings. And we will also say that, we'd like to say that this event will be in English only. My name is, as I said, Björn Egeland. I am Senior Marketing Manager here at Lærdal's headquarters in Stavanger in Norway. And I would like to take just a moment to recognize all of those joining today who have educators and care providers and healthcare workers all over the world who have been really in the front line to try to fight this COVID-19 situation. The next speaker, or the first speaker, will be Dr. Dieckmann, Peter Dieckmann, who will join us from Copenhagen now in a few seconds. Dr. Dieckmann, he is a physiologist, originally born in Germany, but worked for many years in Copenhagen, so hence he is also fluent in Danish. He has been working with simulation since 1999 and with healthcare simulation since 2001. He is currently the head of research at the Copenhagen Academy for Medical Education and Simulation, also known as CAMS, in Copenhagen in Denmark. He is also an associate editor of the journal Simulation in Healthcare. So, Peter, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, Björn, for the kind introduction.
So, how's the weather in Copenhagen today?
We have sunny, a little bit of clouds. We are preparing for summer here, so it's really nice.
Great. Okay, I will leave the microphone to you. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just begin by sharing my screen here with you guys. It feels so funny to know that you are one of the biggest crowd I've ever spoken to, 816 people, 18. And I'm still sitting here in the living room, so it's a strange situation, but very nice challenge. Thank you very much for taking the time to join the Sun meeting here and to listen to my presentation. I'm just, for the record, I'm a psychologist, not a physiologist. So I have been working with simulation for quite some time. And I would like to present work that I've been doing together with colleagues also from Stavanger, Sigrun and Kjetil, you will listen to in a moment, but also Libby and Verity from the UK. And I think their colleagues will talk about the Nightingale Hospital. So it was really an interesting collaboration between the three countries here, where we actually wrote a paper together about the ways of how to use simulation to prevent, to manage the COVID-19 situation, or prevent, it's the wrong word, but to kind of get through it in the best way. In the preparation for this Sun meeting today, I actually looked through the literature and wanted to see kind of what is the new research out there in terms of the role of simulation in COVID-19. So I actually searched PubMed here with the keyword simulation and COVID in the title, and then did a rough hand search, and also got some tips from Sigrun and others about papers that might be interesting. This is not a complete and systematic review, but just the stuff that I could find also with a rather short notice. And I wanted to go through some key points of 19 of these 23 papers that I found. What I actually found interesting is that most, not all, papers around COVID-19 are actually open access. I think that's a very nice move also from the publishers to make the stuff available quickly and freely. We'll come back to also the quickly part in a moment, explaining a little bit the experience that we had with our paper. So let me just give you a rough overview of the topics that I saw in here. So most of the papers that I looked at have in principle the teaching component. Teaching individuals in donning, doffing of equipment, in the procedures, in where the equipment is and so on. But also teaching on a more organizational or departmental level, kind of refining procedures, seeing which material should be where and stuff like this. That also is then linked, kind of the learning and the process and physical layout of the locations. That there were also some papers who basically, by training people, identified challenges in the layout of the rooms or where the equipment was, for example. Then there is interesting papers that kind of look at how would you need to change procedures while in PPE, in personal protection equipment. And doing this in simulation kind of generated some insights there. The timing for donning and doffing of the PPE, which was, for example, also relevant or would be relevant in ambulance services. Then there was also the test of protection equipment, different equipments, simulations of droplets spreading, the infectious spreading here. And then maybe a little bit outside of what I typically would talk about with simulation, the role of modeling and spreading of the disease, but also trying to model which resources would be needed in terms of beds, for example. And also I've found one paper looking at dosing. I would like not to go through all of them in detail, but to highlight a few key points here. I begin with the teaching papers. And whenever you see these, I try to make it a golden frame. It's basically a yellow frame, I guess. That's the papers that I really think is interesting to read. And not only because it's Martin, who you will listen to in just a moment, and the colleagues from Stavanger. What I found really interesting here is, it's a nice paper that the team already has experiences with looking at clinical outcomes in terms of simulation and so on. But it's a nice example here of how training could actually help to prepare people, but also to identify safety threats and how to mitigate them. I'm pretty sure that Martin will go in a little bit more detail in a moment. But I think it's a very nice example of this mix, kind of training people, but also learning around your organizational issues. Another paper here, again, also many of the papers touch on similar aspects, so I don't repeat that. Most of the papers, for example, also look at equipment issues and so on, just highlight basically elements that they would contribute as opposed to the papers I already discussed. So this one also looked at the confidence of the participants in responding to the crisis, or the notion of self-efficacy as we would say as psychologists. Do I trust that I actually have the abilities to deal with the situation? And the paper here showed that also low fidelity simulation had to boost on the confidence in cardiac arrest situations. Whether that always translates to actual improved performance, it's a different question, but it's an important element also to help people build the confidence. Another paper, which I think was quite interesting, how they looked at different elements, so looking at the floor plans and what kind of adjustments could be done in the clinical spaces. Also in terms of how to transport the patients. Like in some hospitals, they actually created one-way streets, that you minimize actually how patients and healthcare professionals are meeting each other during patient transport. They looked at communication. Also, I think interesting, what kind of extra support would you need potentially in this situation, and what could be care pathways? What kind of influence would the potential infection danger have here? Also, what I forgot to mention is you see the references here, and I think the slides will be available later, so you could look up a reference here. This paper I found interesting, as also several others do. I liked this distinction between, what kind of observation do we see here? For example, improper donning techniques, and then what kind of responses would be possible here. And simulation actually helped in some cases to identify possible responses, but also to sort some of the responses out that on paper read like a good idea. But then if you actually try them in simulation, you see, well, you at least have to tweak them, or they might not be as good as you originally thought. And what they looked at also here, improper donning before intubation, during intubation. Excuse me. And then there is this transition to mechanical ventilation after intubation. That is a recurrent theme, which I find extremely interesting in the papers that I looked at. That's to a larger extent than I knew before, people are interested also in these very small elements of the treatment process. Basically, thinking of a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Kind of those things that the parts of the task that are somehow in between. Transition from mechanical ventilation to mechanical ventilation after intubation, for example. For you healthcare professionals might be different, but in a regular debriefing, I think it's much more the intubation part, or then the ventilation part, but kind of this transition from A to B is, I think, something that we don't focus on so often, but where I think often there's a lot of safety gains to be gained, whether that is in the transition here and during intubation, whether it's a transition from the patient from one department to the other. I think, and I would hope that with this crisis in the moment, we actually set the focus even more than we do now on the connections between things. And I think that is a recurrent theme again in many of the papers here. When you look at the improvements that are suggested, this paper I think is an interesting example for many of the others as well, that there's quite a bit of recommendations. We need procedures, and please comply with the standard procedures with all the advantages and disadvantages that they have. We know from many studies that people do not follow procedures as easily as we often hope and so on. And also interesting that there is recommendations of how to improve equipment availability of equipment, layout of rooms, and so on. I think that's an interesting element here coming up. This paper here from Singapore, I think, is extremely interesting also, and that's why it has the yellow frame, because I liked very much the completeness with which they approach the role of simulation in the healthcare of COVID-19 patients to certainly maintain services with COVID-19 patients, but also how do you manage at the same time to still keep non-COVID-19 patients, protect the healthcare workers, HCVs, and also to consider the ethical, social implication of triaging. So when you look in this paper, I think, they really kind of looked at the whole situation with the different requirements, and then how different forms and different settings of simulation could actually help different aspects. So I think that is one very well worth reading. This one also I thought was very interesting, where the idea was we want to reduce the risk of infections during the training and also save PPE. So what they actually have been doing is that they had a smaller team running the simulation, and then via telemedicine, video, audio connections, they actually had people outside who were in principle involved in the simulation, for example, the team leader, but who were not, who did not have to go close to the other people, who could therefore save PPE and still reduce the infection risk. And I think that's actually one of the interesting elements where our current creativity might actually be interesting later on also for rural settings, in Norway for doing trainings on the oil platforms, maybe, or any kind of other remote location, I think, where we actually could gain some experiences and run simulations that to one degree or the other actually involve larger groups of people, for example. That's also something that we have been thinking about in our student courses. Could we use something like this where we have a small team and then video, audio transmit the simulations to others who then could be involved in the debriefing? So maybe some ideas to look into here. That's rough overview of the papers that I looked at in terms of more learning aspects. Testing papers. So I think this was interesting, resuscitation in PPE. And the recommendation that they had in their conclusion, whenever possible, use automated chest compression devices because it's so straining to actually do it in full PPE. If that is not possible, they suggested to actually change the cardiopulmonary resuscitation algorithm, especially kind of reducing the 2-minute cycles to 1-minute cycle before you change the person who's doing the compression, because it's so much more exhausting in the PPE. I will also come back to that with this one here. How easily can you actually say we should implement a change? You know, is one study enough? When they looked at and I must say I forgot how many people they looked at. It's not huge samples in all these studies here. But based on the study here, is it enough to make a recommendation, change from 2 minutes to 1-minute cycle? Maybe. This one here is an interesting example of this. Should you use the aerosol boxes here to protect healthcare professionals from the droplets in principle during intubation? And what they see that they might have an effect there, but they also increase the intubation time, and they actually had the danger of damaging the personal protective equipment. So I think both examples show that the role of simulation could be to show the advantages and disadvantages that you would get, the wished for and not wished for effects, side effects potentially of any kind of solution. And I think that is an interesting consideration where simulation can help to kind of screen ideas, you know, is that working or not? But then where we also potentially would need more in-depth studies, you know, following up on does it really make sense in clinical practice or not? So again, how quickly can we make recommendations on to change clinical procedures based on the findings from simulation studies? Infection ways, I thought that was an interesting study where they actually removed one lung from the simulator and inserted a reservoir that had kind of these fluorescent particles in a liquid, and then they were pumping to actually show then with the light how far would the droplets actually spread during intubation, for example. I think it's a very nice example also of using different media to show something in a very, I think, impressive way that you would never kind of see in reality, where simulation offers, in combination with other techniques, ways of showing something that you could not do so easily in clinical practice. There's another study that tried to do a similar thing with cadavers. So where they kind of looked at also how droplets would be spread. And here coming back again to the what I said before, extreme caution should be used avoiding activating powered instruments when outside of the cavity. But I'm coming back to this notion of in between things. Usually, probably it wouldn't really make a difference whether you switch on the instrument, you know, when you're outside of the body again. But here, this small element is actually what could generate a problem in terms of the infection. So this notion of think processes through in all corners and also the smaller links, the connecting points and so on. I think it's a really interesting focus point that emerges from these type of studies. They looked at the two bodies that they investigated in different procedures and found different spreads here of potential droplets. if you're interested, I would ask you to go into details with the papers. Modeling, I'm not an expert on modeling. It's just, they try to model the spread of the disease using also regression analysis, maybe simulation and citation marks. Yeah, I think it's more the modeling thing. Study from different countries, and also looking at, depending on how long the patients would stay in bed, how many beds do we actually need. So I think it's interesting to also use simulative thoughts, procedures, modeling approaches to kind of match the resources that we need. And maybe that the colleagues from London come back to this, how actually scaling up of resources and whether there were some considerations, how many beds do we actually need. Also a study here on how much chloroquine would you need in terms of the doses, and to refine the recommendations here. So much as a very rough overview of the studies that I looked at. When you look into the solutions that are suggested, then, as I said before, you see a lot of create, follow standard procedures. Also, adjustment of procedures to the requirements of treating COVID-19 patients. For example, the recommendation of moving from 2 to 1 minute in changing cycles during resuscitation. But as I also said before, interesting that it's not only in citation marks what people should do, but also the layout of rooms, the workflow, who should come in, how can we minimize the contacts with potential infectious colleagues, with patients and so on. How could we also organize the patient flow through the hospital and so on, and then provide also the resources needed, which one would you need where and so on. So I think the papers that I looked at here, even more than I know it from the literature, kind of have this combination of training people, but also optimize the working conditions that they have. None of this is new. There's papers around these issues for many years, but I think the immediate combination of these two things, I think, is more prominent than the papers that I looked at. Now I would like to step back a little bit from the papers that I looked at into a more conceptual basis. So I think one concept that really points out here, as always, is Eric Holnagel's efficiency is the roughness trade-off, the ETO. That for many of the solutions that you see, again, they have advantages, disadvantages. Think of the aerosol protectors there. They might prevent the droplets, but they also increase the time. They might even increase the risk of tearing the PPE. So especially under these time pressure situations in which many people worked right now, and that is required by the crisis situation, how can we still make sure that we do not introduce something where where the solution creates more problems than it helps for? And I think in situ simulations, but also other forms of simulation, really have a role in, again, screening how clinically relevant, how clinically sustainable are actually the solutions that we have been thinking about in our offices, for example. So this ETO, efficiency, the roughness, do you do it quickly? Do you do it right? It's also another way of kind of saying that is a dilemma that you always have, and I think that is really very relevant also in the current situation. A note on science publication here. I think it's interesting when you look into the material here, the journal publications are almost too slow. So there's a lot of discussion also on Twitter, discussion boards, the SSH discussion board, for example, YouTube, these social media is actually quicker. Our group, with the publication I will discuss with you in a moment, we were, I think, pretty quick in putting this together, and the journal was also pretty quick in putting it out there. But still, the whole process takes about 3-4 weeks, at least. And then in this situation, that is almost too slow. So I think it's also an interesting question of how do we actually disseminate the findings that we have. In what format can we do that? That's as a side remark. I would like to go a little bit into more detail in the paper that we have written. Sorry for looking at our own paper in more detail here. So you see, Shetty and Sigmund will talk about the experience in Moment, Libby, and Verity, working in London, and Hege also from Stavanger. We kind of got together and tried to pull some thoughts together here, some concepts from the experiences in the different countries in Denmark, Norway, and the UK. Open access publication in Advances in Simulation. There's also more papers coming out there. We try to, in the paper, step back a little bit in the first place and think about what kind of situation do we actually need to prepare people for. So this notion of needs analysis, that's a guiding principle in our work. What do people need to do, and how can simulation actually help them to do that better? And some of the key points that we thought here is clinical care is sensitive to error as always, but especially also here in the COVID-19 situation, and also here that there's a higher risk for healthcare professionals themselves to get infected. And therefore, training in the clinical environment is also risky. Think back of the study that I showed you with the telemedicine, where they try to work especially with the third part also to reduce the danger of getting infected during training. If you put all this together, it's a prime textbook example for the role of simulation, where you actually, by using simulation, can potentially decrease cognitive load because people might be less scared, for example, of getting the infections themselves, and therefore actually have more resources to think through processes to optimize their own learning and so on. That is a prime example where simulation could help. High personal risk for healthcare professionals. I think there's actually quite impressive pictures out there. We risk our lives to save yours. So I think the vulnerability, the fears of healthcare professionals themselves become very prominent, relatively very prominent in this crisis here. When you look into Twitter, over 205 healthcare workers have died from COVID-19 in May 2020, kind of people showing pictures like this. And that made me select a picture that might be a little bit controversial here, and let's see what you think about this. And this is this notion of the chicken is involved, the pig is committed. I often think about, first of all, I don't mean this disrespectful by using this picture here, but I often think about the difference in this sense between pilots and healthcare professionals working with simulation. So pilots kind of really committed if there is an error. Healthcare professionals, you would be involved, and with the second victim issues and so on, you're also very involved. And people are professional, they want to do a good job and so on. But still, as long as the patient is who suffers from this, different things are at stake. And I think the COVID-19 kind of pushes the situation more towards, in this sense here, a commitment. If there is an error, if you do not don, and to do for that matter your PPE in the right way, you might actually be in danger more. And I think that is an opportunity to raise different kinds of questions and to discuss on a different level. And one way of doing this would be to what we call the personal focus. I start from the bottom here in this slide. So I think this notion of when you are in this way also committed, involved in the potential challenges, healthcare professionals also seem to be more open in discussing emotional aspects of care and how much emotion is actually a part of the professional role that you have. Is that something that should be put aside So you can concentrate on your thinking processes or not, or how much do emotions actually influence how you think, how you perceive, and so on. And I would argue with lots of theoretical backup that we are, as human beings, much less cognitive than we tend to think, and that our emotions play a big role. And this personal focus with the emotional side, and how we also could support healthcare workers in making these decisions that potentially are challenging, in going to work, being under stress of getting the disease themselves and so on, to kind of take that as an opportunity to lift these emotional parts also into a more professional roles. And I will come back to this in the next slide. So what we saw, and what we also thought constructed the role of simulation, besides the personal focus, would be the educational focus. How can you qualify, requalify personnel to function in various positions, qualifying regular ward nurses to function as intensive care ward nurses, for example. The system focus, how can we optimize workflows, the bottlenecks, dependencies, and so on. All of this is what you also saw in the literature that I referred to in the beginning of the talk. Coming back again to the personal issues, I think there's a window of opportunity with this, where we can actually say, you know, being healthcare professional will inherently bring you in situations that are challenging because you are dealing with sick people, for example. You will not be able to help all of them. So part of the role is situations that is maybe not so easy to find your own emotional stance to. In my perception as an outsider, but also in the conversation with lots of my clinical colleagues, all these emotional strain is basically on your personal shoulders. You have to find a way of dealing with this. And I think the window of opportunity in the moment is with this different, are you involved or committed picture. We have a window of opportunity to say, actually, we need to also address this. We need to help in the basic educations, in medicine, in nursing, in midwifery, in all the healthcare professions, to also help people to, you know, prepare them to work with these emotional straining situations. Libby and Verity, they used the term psychological PPE, and maybe the colleagues from London come back to that. That seems to be a term that you have been discussing in London. What is elements of the psychological PPE that prevents you not only in these crisis situations, but also in everyday situations where the strain might be much less? But many people have this picture of their small elements that you put into your backpack all the time. And how can we prevent that the backpack is getting so heavy over time that healthcare professionals also get sick? And I think there we really have an opportunity to make these aspects a legitimate part of professionality of simulation scenarios and debriefings. And as simulation educators, most of us, I would hope all of us, have also the tool and the mindset to actually go deeper into the frames, into the experience, perceptions of people, and facilitate a reflection around these issues. And how does that actually impact your own work? How does that impact the health and safety of the patient and of your co-workers and so on? So I think there is this window of opportunity. I'm checking a little bit of time here, so yeah, it's good. Another element which I think is interesting also in the studies that I mentioned and important to work with is different levels of learning. So if I work, you know, I might experience a challenge, and as human beings, we are very good problem solvers, and many of the challenge that we either create ourselves or that we simply encounter, we manage to solve ourselves. I think it's also very important whenever we talk about human factors, that is often, you know, kind of as if we only commit errors and so on. Yes, we commit errors sometimes, but we also fix many of them. So important to note, how can we as persons actually fix problems? Some of the problems are so large that we should work together, and that is all the notion of crisis, crew resource management, teamwork, all these kind of things. How can we collaborate to fix problems? There's a third level, the organizational level. And I think the papers that I mentioned is good examples that, you know, sometimes you not only try to help me and my colleagues to work with the missing machine or to work around the missing machine. Here we actually saw that people say, well, there's a machine missing, we need to organize that. Where we lift from problem solving to organizational change. And I think in the current situation, organizations are much more willing to listen to simulation professionals to say, you know, what can we learn from you to organize our whole processes, our own organization? And whenever you run simulations, to keep an eye on during the simulations, during the debriefings, is there something that Lisa and Peter should organize, that they should learn individually? But who else would you need to talk about that Lisa and Peter actually had this problem? Should a specific department know around? And it's not around Lisa and Peter, but they as an example, you know, what you see with your participants, you know, who else would need to know around these problems that you potentially can help to protect or remedy the problems on a more systematic level in the organization? Take an active role and listen, dear leadership of Department XYZ, you might have a problem with this and that. That is what we saw in the simulation. Again, not about the individual person, but on a principle level. Work as imagined, work as done. I think, again, also that there's a difference there. You know, what's written in the algorithm is to 99% not how work actually unfolds in practice. And I think simulation, in situ simulation, for example, can have a brilliant role in adapting, for example, procedures. How do they actually unfold in actual practice with PPE, for example, and not only by the book. One way of doing this is also to use Eric Holnagel's FROM model here. Whenever you have an activity, there's an input, that is what triggers the activity, and there's an output, that is what you want to get out of this. There are some timing aspects. Is there a sequence in which you should do steps? How long does the individual step take? Putting on PPE takes time, for example. Do you consider that in your procedures? Control, what is the official guidelines and what is the unofficial culture? How I do things when nobody is checking? You know, how do things actually unfold there? What is prerequisites before you can start with an activity? And what are the resources that you need while the activity is running? I think this model is quite interesting when you think through systematically varying these conditions. How would you optimize treatment in different situations? What if you have 2 minutes less than you used to? Varying the time aspect, for example. What if you do not have the PPE, for example? A model, I think, interesting for the design of scenarios and conducting debriefings. To summarize, what I think really important, coming back also to the ETO principle, being quick, being thorough, even in the current situation where we would need fast, really take the time to do the needs analysis. What are the tasks that people need to do? What is the context? And what kind of people do I have? What is their starting point with? What would they need to learn? And to actually try to find the balance between these different elements and to run simulations that are relevant and debrief in a way that is relevant. Last example around this would be decision-making, for example. So as psychologists, we would distinguish between selection tasks and decision tasks. And a lot, the difference is here, selection is basically you have learned the rule. If red, then most of the time, you would actually stop your car, your bicycle, or if you're on foot. So it's basically, once you have learned that, there's no real decision involved anymore. Versus, for example, a traffic not here like this, where you have to decide, do I go left or right, which way do I take, where you actually have a real decision here, where it's no clear answer immediately. When you look at a lot of the algorithms, I could ask you, is that a selection or a decision task? And I would actually argue it's most of the time a selection task. There's two decisions when you have algorithms, that you have to decide which algorithm and potentially how to deviate. And otherwise you would in principle say, where am I in my algorithm? And then you select the appropriate response. Putting this in the context of the COVID-19 patients, I've been discussing that quite a bit with Kjetil from Stavanger, where the notion with the pre-ambulance personnel is that they are basically trained to more function in the selection way, kind of identify the algorithm and then follow through. In case you have questions, ring to the backup people, the more experienced people, also potentially in the hospital and so on, and discuss your decisions. In the preparation of the COVID-19, we had the anticipation that the senior people that you usually would ask might simply be busy. So that would have an implication that the nature of the task changes. They would have to take more real, in citation marks, decision on the spot. And therefore, we might have to change training procedures, for example. That is a very sketchy example here of how the nature of the task would change in a situation, for example, with COVID-19, and what kind of implication that might have for the training. And again, the more we think this through, the more targeted our simulations can be. Let me summarize implications here. I talked about this. A summary. So I think simulation actually can play a substantial role, or did play and still is playing a substantial role for the individual organizational learning. A preventive and also reactive way of how to optimize the response to a situation like COVID-19. And I think very nicely to see that the focus is enlarging from the training the individual towards also to include technology, locations, processes, and so on.
Thank you very much,
That was my overview.
Peter.
Thank you.
I have a few questions, if I may.
Please.
You have been involved in situation in simulation all over the world, and you know, you have contact with colleagues from all over the world. What is your opinion? How motivated are health providers to take the time needed to set up and go through with simulation in situations like this? Do they take the time they need to do it?
Whether they take the time they need, I don't know. I think they are willing to take time, and they also, leadership is more willing to actually give them time, because they also see that in many contexts they kind of see immediate benefits from doing so. So probably you could always simulate more, but I think yes, there is time freed.
They absolutely see the value to it,
yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
And next question. There are many, you talked about the pre-hospital personnel as one group here. There are many different types of medical personnel, of course, involved here. You have the different types of physicians, doctors, you have nurses, you have paramedics and others. Is there any difference between them on how they take feedback based on simulation that they have been part of? Is there some groups who stand out to be more or less perceptive to take, how can I say, suggested corrections?
I cannot answer that question really. I would fall too much into stereotypes. Sorry.
Yes. So what is your, you know, I know that you have been involved, and your article contains also experience both from Stavanger, from Copenhagen, and from UK. But what is your general impression? Has simulation been actively used throughout the world to try to cope with this tsunami of COVID-19 cases that we have seen?
Yes, but also I think in a quite different way and to a quite different extent. So I think also maybe going back to your first question, I think in some systems, in some organizations, people see it even more easily that it makes sense. In others, it's kind of also disturbing. We have to keep our shop running, so why would we actually send you to train and something? Stuff like this, arguments like this. I do see a difference also in terms of what they focus on. So I think that the focus is quite a bit on the learning focus, even though that I said, there is also a bit of the system focus coming in. I think actually that could even be stronger. I think simulation could have an even stronger role. There's still the impulse of helping individuals to perform better, which also makes a lot of sense. But I think also to kind of look into the system focus. And I think we're really, it would make a lot of sense to also enlarge this, what we call the personal focus. Take care of the healthcare professionals themselves, like the study from Singapore, for example, points out so nicely.
I have a question here from Salex. In developing countries, which are basically understaffed, is the simulation still feasible, in your opinion?
I think it actually is an investment and not a use or a waste of resources. I think by investing a bit of time into going into simulation, you can filter out quite a bit of challenges later in your work process. How do we do things? How do we coordinate things? How do we save stuff and so on? I think it's a good investment. It takes resources, but I think it's a good investment and not a waste of resources.
Last question here, let's say, with this new model of medical care, will it be necessary to have clothing in the simulation centers to teach them the complete scenarios?
To have clothing?
Yeah,
PPE?
I mean, PPE. As you said, it takes time to put the clothes on. Just as it takes time from you take a blood sample you have the answer. So in a way, I guess it plays all into the big picture. You can't just say, okay, now we have the clothes on, because it will take you a few minutes to put it on. In the meantime, stuff is happening with the patient.
Yeah, I would argue that it depends on the learning goal. So if your learning goal is the overall coordination of different people and resources and the timing aspects and so on, I think then it's important that you actually simulate that. And might even be that you say you have to wait there 38 seconds before you can come back. If it's around the timing, I think it would be important to do so. If it's other things, you might kind of take shortcuts potentially. I think it depends really on the learning goal. But by default, I think the more full task that we train, the better it is later in clinical environment for most learning goals. So
last question, you are managing you're managing the camp center in Copenhagen. Have this COVID-19 crisis led to changes at your own center, maybe even lasting changes? The way you train, the way you organize?
So I'm not managing it. I'm.
No, yeah, well.
Yeah.
You're part of the management.
Yeah. So first of all, we stopped all of our courses that were planned, and then we were jumping in, into these fire rescue activities of helping train people.
Putting out fires.
Yeah, exactly. And we are also working, like many others, on kind of doing more online and e-learning stuff and so on. But otherwise, the more long-lasting changes, we are still trying to figure out, finding our feet. What does that actually mean for us? And we also kind of counting, some when it will be over. But that is something that we are still kind of finding our feet on.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dieckmann, for sharing your insight with us today. And to the audience, we hope that through this presentation, we have provided you with some information that you need or think you will need to prepare to keep both personnel and patients safe under the current crisis conditions, ultimately to help save more lives. Thank you very much again. And we will then be counting down to the next session, which starts in 4 minutes. Thank you very much.